October 23rd, 1942. The Western Desert. Dawn breaks over El Alamein with the color of rust and gold, casting long shadows across tank tracks that scar the sand like wounds. In a command vehicle parked beneath camouflage netting, Erwin Rommel bends over maps marked with red pencil, his fingers tracing supply routes that no longer exist. The air smells of diesel and heat. Outside, radio operators tap Morse code into the static, their messages racing invisibly across the Mediterranean sky. They do not know that every word they send is already being read in a manor house 6,000 kilometers away. Rommel adjusts his peaked cap and reaches for the telephone. His voice, when he speaks, carries the confidence of a man who has never lost a major battle in North Africa. The confidence will not survive the week. For 18 months, Rommel has been the ghost haunting British nightmares. His Africa course moves like water through the desert, appearing where it should not be, vanishing before counterattacks can form. Churchill calls him a great general. British newspapers, against their own interests, print his tactical brilliance as if documenting a natural force. But this October morning, something has shifted in the mechanics of the war. The British Eighth Army, now under Bernard Montgomery, sits across the line with more tanks, more guns, more men than Rommel has ever faced. Supply convoys that should have reached Tobruk lie at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Fuel reserves run low. Ammunition stockpiles thin. Rommel writes to his wife that he feels unwell, that the desert has begun to poison him. He does not yet understand that it is not the desert that knows his movements. It is the enemy. Montgomery's plan begins with deception. False radio traffic, dummy tanks made of wood and canvas placed in the south, a phantom invasion that exists only in transmitted lies. But the true invasion, the real weight of Operation Lightfoot, gathers in the north where Rommel's defenses are thinnest. On the night of October 23rd, 1,000 British guns open fire simultaneously. The barrage lasts 5 hours. Shells fall so thick that soldiers describe the sound as a single continuous roar, not individual explosions, but one vast tearing of the world. Rommel is not present. He is in Austria, recovering from illness, believing his deputy can hold the line. He receives the call at dawn. The front is breaking. He boards a plane immediately, flying south over landscapes that grow progressively more hostile, more alien, until the green of Europe becomes the absolute beige of Libya. By the time he reaches his headquarters, the British have already advanced 6 kilometers. His first question: what is their strength? The answer makes him reach for a chair. The battle unfolds in 3 dimensions now. On the ground, infantry push through minefields lit by flares that turn night into sickly yellow day. Tank columns duel at ranges where crews can see the faces of enemy gunners through the smoke. In the air, RAF bombers pound supply depots that Rommel desperately needs intact. And in the invisible dimension, the dimension Rommel does not know exists, Bletchley Park reads his every transmission. When he requests fuel, Ultra decodes it. When he shifts divisions, Ultra tracks them. When he plans a counterattack, Montgomery knows the coordinates before Rommel's own tanks receive their orders. The Enigma cipher, thought unbreakable by German high command, breaks every day under the mathematics of Alan Turing and the labor of thousands of analysts who turn encrypted noise into plain German text. Rommel fights a war where his opponent reads his mind. On October 28th, he attempts a counterattack using his last reserves. The 21st Panzer Division moves at night, engines throttled low, radio silence maintained except for essential commands. At dawn, they strike at what reconnaissance suggests is a weak point in British lines. They are met by concentrated artillery fire, so precise it seems clairvoyant. Tank after tank explodes in the coordinated barrage. The division retreats with 60% casualties. Rommel stands at his field headquarters, listening to the reports come in through crackling radio speakers. An officer suggests the British have improved their reconnaissance aircraft. Another mentions captured documents, though no documents have been lost. Rommel says nothing. He stares at the map where his offensive arrows now point backward, toward retreat. Something in the pattern disturbs him, but the shape of it remains unclear, like a word half remembered. November 2nd. The 8th Army breaks through the Axis line completely. British tanks pour into open desert beyond the minefields and defensive positions that were supposed to stop them. Rommel's remaining forces fall back in disorder, abandoning vehicles when fuel runs out, jettisoning equipment to increase speed. Hitler sends a telegram. Stand fast. Victory or death. Rommel reads it and gives the order to retreat anyway. It is the first time in his military career that he directly disobeys the Führer. In his diary that night, he writes a sentence that will haunt historians. The enemy's information network appears almost supernatural. Not better reconnaissance, not superior numbers, information. The word sits on the page like an accusation. The retreat becomes a rout. 2,000 kilometers westward across Libya, through Tripoli, into Tunisia. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of German tactical doctrine, dissolves into scattered battle groups trying to stay ahead of British armor. Rommel requests constant radio silence, but operational necessity forces communication. Every time his units transmit, Ultra reads the traffic. Montgomery's forces pursue with an accuracy that seems to anticipate German movements days before they occur. When Rommel plans to make a stand at Mersa Brega, British tanks arrive first. When he attempts to fortify the Mareth line, supplies that should reach him sink to convoy interdiction so perfectly timed it defies probability. In January 1943, meeting with staff officers in a bunker outside Tunis, Rommel spreads intelligence reports across a table and speaks the words that mark the true end of his desert campaign. They knew before I moved. The room goes silent. Officers exchange glances. One suggests that there must be a spy in headquarters, perhaps multiple spies. Counterintelligence conducts sweeps, interrogates personnel, changes codes, alters procedures. Nothing helps. The pattern continues. British forces react to German plans faster than seems possible through conventional intelligence methods. Rommel begins writing his orders by hand, delivering them through motorcycle courier instead of radio. But the larger strategic picture still requires electronic communication, and every transmission that gets encoded in Enigma arrives in Bletchley Park 8 minutes later, decoded by machines that make no mistakes. The mathematics is absolute. The encryption, thought perfect by Berlin's cryptographers, is transparent. Germany fights this war believing its communications are secure, and that belief costs them Africa. March 1943. Rommel flies back to Germany, officially for health reasons, unofficially because the situation in Tunisia is beyond salvaging. He meets with Hitler and tries to explain what he has learned in the desert. That something fundamental has broken in German operational security, that the enemy reads German intentions as if by telepathy. Hitler dismisses him. The Enigma cipher, tested by Germany's best mathematicians, is unbreakable. Rommel's failures must come from other causes: insufficient willpower, inadequate aggression, the corrupting effect of too much defensive thinking. Rommel leaves the meeting knowing he will never command in North Africa again. The remaining Axis forces surrender in May 1943. Over 200,000 men marching into captivity with their hands raised. The largest single German defeat until Stalingrad. History will debate what might have changed if Rommel had understood earlier. If German high command had suspected that Enigma was compromised and switched to different encryption systems. If Ultra's secret had been exposed in 1941 instead of remaining hidden until the 1970s. But the nature of information warfare is that the victim often cannot see the wound. Rommel fought with brilliance against an enemy who fought with omniscience. And omniscience, even the limited tactical omniscience of decrypted radio traffic, trumps brilliance every time. The genius of maneuver cannot outrun the certainty of knowledge. The will to win cannot overcome an opponent who reads your plans before you give the orders. Bletchley Park never appears in battlefield after-action reports. The cryptanalysts who broke Enigma receive no medals, give no interviews, write no memoirs until decades after the war ends. They work in silence, translating German confidence into Allied victory, one decoded message at a time. When Rommel drives his last command vehicle toward the Tunisian border in March 1943, the radio in his vehicle transmits position and destination automatically through standard Wehrmacht protocols. At Bletchley Park, the message arrives, gets processed through the bomb machines, and emerges as clear text. Retreat to defensive line Alpha. An analyst marks it on a tracking board. Montgomery's headquarters receives the decrypt within the hour. 36 hours later, RAF bombers strike the defensive line before Rommel's forces arrive to occupy it. There is a kind of tragedy in fighting so well while being read so completely. Rommel's tactical decisions were often correct. His maneuvers textbook examples of mobile warfare. His understanding of combined arms ahead of most contemporary commanders. But every correct decision, transmitted by radio, became an Allied advantage. Every brilliant maneuver, coordinated through encrypted signals, turned into an opportunity for interdiction. He played chess, believing his opponent could only see the pieces currently visible on the board, not understanding that his opponent saw every piece he planned to move 3 turns ahead. The game was unwinnable from the first transmission. In the final accounting of the North African campaign, historians list causes for Axis defeat: supply line vulnerability, fuel shortages, numerical inferiority, strategic overextension. All true. All insufficient as explanation. The hidden factor, the invisible weight on the scales, is information asymmetry so complete that it resembles magic. Ultra breaks more than codes. It breaks the assumption of fair contest that makes warfare comprehensible to those fighting it. Rommel loses not to better generals, though Montgomery is competent, nor to braver soldiers, though the Eighth Army fights with determination. He loses to mathematics and secrecy, to machines that strip away the fog of war from one side while leaving it thick for the other. Rommel survives the desert, but not the war. In July 1944, after being implicated in the conspiracy against Hitler, he takes poison rather than face trial. He dies believing his failures came from insufficient resources and bad strategic decisions made in Berlin. He never learns about Bletchley Park. never discovers that his genius was less deficient than his security. Never understands that the greatest disadvantage in war is not fighting an enemy who is stronger, but fighting an enemy who knows everything you plan to do before you do it. His last diary entry from North Africa, written in February 1943, contains a single question that will remain unanswered for him. How did they always know? Some battles are lost not on the field, but in the spaces between transmission and reception, where signals travel unseen and mathematics works in silence. Some generals are defeated not by enemy commanders, but by enemy cryptographers, people whose names they will never hear and whose work they cannot imagine. And some wars are decided by the ones who understand that information, properly used, is not just an advantage. It is the difference between fighting a war and already knowing its outcome. The desert keeps its secrets until the historians arrive. But the manor house in Buckinghamshire keeps its secrets longer. Longer than memory. Longer than honor. Long enough that the men who lose never understand why they lost, and the certainty of their confusion becomes its own kind of victory. February 1944. Hermann Göring sat alone in his study at Hall, his massive hunting estate north of Berlin. Outside, snow covered the grounds. Inside, the room was warm. Too warm. He loosened his collar and reached for the paper on his desk. It was a casualty report from the previous week. Operation argument. The Americans called it Big Week. Göring read the numbers once, then again, then a third time, hoping they would change. They didn't. 226 fighters lost in 6 days. Not damaged, not captured, lost, gone, burned, crashed, destroyed. His hands trembled, not from fear, from something worse. Recognition. He picked up his pen, drew a line through the numbers, put the pen down, picked it up again. The tip hovered over the paper, shaking. He wanted to write something, an order, a directive, a plan. Nothing came, because deep down, in a place he didn't want to look, Hermann Göring already knew the truth. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing, it was broken, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. It hadn't always been this way. 4 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had been a force of nature. Over Poland in 1939, German dive bombers screamed from the sky, shattering Polish defenses in days. Over France in 1940, Stuka sirens announced the fall of an empire. Over the English Channel, Messerschmitt fighters dueled Spitfires in the summer sun. They didn't always win, but they were always feared. And Hermann Göring, he was their architect, their champion, their symbol. Hitler's right hand, Reich Minister of Aviation, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall, a rank created just for him, higher than any field marshal in German history. When he walked into a room, officers stood. When he spoke, generals listened. When he promised Hitler air superiority, it was delivered. The Luftwaffe had been his masterpiece. 2,000 bombers, 3,000 fighters. The largest air force in the world. Modern, fast, deadly. Göring promised Hitler the sky. And for 2 years, he kept that promise. But promises don't win wars. Numbers do. And by 1944, the numbers had turned. America entered the war in December 1941. At first, it didn't matter. The Americans were far away, unprepared. Their bombers flew in daylight. Suicide, the Germans thought. Easy targets. They were wrong. The Americans kept coming, and coming, and coming. B-17 flying fortresses. Hundreds of them, flying in formations so tight. Their combined firepower could shred German fighters. Escorted by P-51 Mustangs, long-range fighters that could fly all the way to Berlin and back. German pilots scrambled to intercept. Some succeeded. Most didn't. The ones who survived told stories of American formations stretching horizon to horizon. Unstoppable. Relentless. The Luftwaffe bled. Göring ordered more planes built. They were built. But there wasn't enough fuel to fly them. He demanded more pilots trained. They were trained. But they had 20 hours of flight time instead of 200. Children, really. Sent up to die against veterans. The myth of German air superiority crumbled. Not all at once. Slowly. Painfully. Like watching a cathedral collapse one stone at a time. By February 1944, the collapse was nearly complete. All that remained was for Göring to admit it. He wasn't ready. Big Week started on February 20th, 1944. Clear skies. Perfect flying weather. The Americans launched the largest air offensive in history. Over 3,000 bombers, escorted by 900 fighters. Their target, German aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, engine works, the heart of Luftwaffe production. The plan was simple. Destroy Germany's ability to build planes, force the Luftwaffe to defend, bleed it dry. It worked. On the first day, the Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter. They rose to meet the bombers over central Germany. The sky filled with fire, contrails, smoke, falling planes. The Germans fought hard, bravely, desperately. They lost. 42 fighters shot down. The bombers continued on, hit their targets, returned home. Day 2, same result. 53 fighters lost. Day 3, 61. Day 4. The weather cleared completely. Over 900 American bombers filled the sky. The Luftwaffe threw everything up, everything. They lost 70 fighters. The Americans lost 21 bombers. By day 6, the math was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed. Not defeated in battle, destroyed as a fighting force, as a strategic weapon, as the shield of the Reich. 226 fighters lost in 6 days. That was the official count. The real number was higher. Damaged planes that would never fly again. Pilots too injured to return. Aircraft abandoned for lack of fuel. And the factories the Americans targeted? They burned. Production dropped by half, then by 3/4. But the numbers on paper only told part of the story. The real collapse was happening inside the Luftwaffe itself. Pilots stopped believing. In the officers' mess, they whispered. At briefings, they looked at the floor. After missions, they drank too much and said too little. They knew. The veterans, the ones who survived Poland, France, Russia, they had a look in their eyes. Not fear, resignation. They'd seen enough dogfights to understand the math. When the enemy has 5 planes for every one of yours. Courage doesn't matter. Skill doesn't matter. You fight, you die. That's all. The young pilots, fresh from training, barely knew how to take off. 20 flight hours, 30 if they were lucky, thrown into combat against American aces with 500 hours. It was murder. Commanders stopped planning offensives. They planned retreats, defensive actions, delaying tactics, words that meant the same thing, survival. And Göring's officers? They stopped pretending. In Berlin, at staff meetings, when Göring raged about cowardice and demanded more effort, his generals nodded, agreed, said nothing. Then they left the room and told their aides the truth. The Reichsmarschall was delusional, living in 1940. The Luftwaffe he commanded existed only in his imagination. One colonel, asked why German fighters weren't defending Berlin, answered flatly, "Because they don't exist." Another, pressed for a status report, simply said, "We have no planes, no fuel, no pilots. What report would you like me to write?" The whispers became jokes. Bitter jokes. Dark jokes. What's the difference between the Luftwaffe and the Sahara? The Sahara still has a few Messerschmitts left. Goering heard the jokes, heard the whispers. He called his officers traitors, cowards, defeatists. He threatened courts-martial, executions, disgrace. It changed nothing. Because the problem wasn't morale. It wasn't courage. It wasn't loyalty. The problem was reality. And reality, in February 1944, was this. The Luftwaffe had lost control of German skies. American bombers flew in daylight, unopposed. German cities burned. Factories crumbled. Civilians died. And Hermann Göring, Reich Minister of Aviation, architect of the Luftwaffe, the man who promised Hitler the sky. He could do nothing but watch. Göring stopped going to Hitler's briefings. He stopped visiting airfields. He stopped answering phone calls from desperate commanders begging for reinforcements that didn't exist. Instead, he stayed at Karen Hall, surrounded by stolen art, medieval tapestries, Renaissance paintings, sculptures looted from France, Poland, Russia, beauty taken from the ruins of Europe. He hosted dinner parties, wore elaborate uniforms, white silk, gold braid, medals covering his chest. He laughed too loud, drank too much, took morphine for pain that wasn't physical. His staff knew better than to mention the war. But one afternoon in late February, something broke through the haze. Göring was in Berlin for a ceremony, some award, some speech. He didn't remember what. Afterward, he stood on the balcony of his Air Ministry headquarters, overlooking the city. It was a beautiful day. Early spring, the sky was impossibly blue, cloudless, clear. He lit a cigarette, inhaled, looked up, and froze. The sky stretched above him, endless and empty. No fighters climbing, no bombers returning, no contrails, no engine roar, no radio chatter crackling from the tower below. Nothing. Just silence, and blue, and emptiness. Then, far to the west, he saw them. Silver specks, high up, moving in perfect formation. American B-17s. He counted 1, 5, 10, 20, more. An entire wing, flying over Berlin, in daylight, unopposed. No German fighters rose to intercept. No sirens wailed. No flak burst around them. They simply flew, straight, steady, untouchable. Göring stood motionless, watching. The cigarette burned down to his fingers. He didn't notice. Minutes passed. The bombers disappeared over the eastern horizon. The sky returned to its empty blue. Still, he didn't move. Because in that moment, standing on that balcony, watching enemy planes cross his capital without resistance, Hermann Göring finally understood. The Luftwaffe was gone. Not defeated, not damaged, not temporarily weakened. Gone. He'd built it, commanded it, promised it would protect Germany. And now, when it mattered most, when the Reich needed it most, it wasn't there. The sky belonged to America, and there was nothing he could do about it. He stood there for a long time, long after the bombers vanished, long after the cigarette burned out, long after his aide came to find him. When he finally turned to go inside, his face was blank, empty, like the sky above him. He didn't speak. What was there to say? The truth was right there, overhead, inescapable. He'd built the Luftwaffe to rule the sky. Instead, he'd watched it die. And worse, far worse, he knew he'd failed the one man who trusted him most. Hitler had given him everything: power, prestige, glory, asked for one thing in return: control of the air. Göring couldn't deliver. The Americans owned the sky now. And with it, they would win the war. After that day, Göring disappeared from the war. Not literally. He still held his titles, still attended ceremonies, still wore his uniforms and medals. But the fire was gone. The energy, the arrogance that once made him seem larger than life. He became a ghost in his own command. Hitler summoned him to strategy meetings. Göring made excuses: illness, fatigue, important matters at Karen Hall. When he did attend, he sat silently in the corner, staring at maps without seeing them. Generals asked for reinforcements. Göring waved them away. "Do what you can," he'd mutter. Then leave. Pilots sent desperate reports from the front. No fuel, no ammunition, no spare parts. The reports piled up on his desk, unread. His staff learned not to bother him with details. The Luftwaffe was disintegrating, and its commander had checked out. He retreated to Karen Hall, spent days wandering through his gallery, staring at stolen masterpieces, ate enormous meals, drank vintage wine, took more morphine. He threw parties, lavish, absurd parties while German cities burned. Guests arrived in furs and jewels, ate 7-course dinners, danced until dawn. Outside, refugees fled the Allied advance. Inside, Göring played the gracious host, performing a role from a world that no longer existed. His aides whispered that he'd gone mad, or collapsed, or simply given up. They were wrong. He hadn't gone mad. He understood perfectly. He'd built something magnificent, something he believed was invincible, and he'd watched it shatter. Not because of betrayal or bad luck, but because he'd been outthought, outproduced, overwhelmed. The Americans built more planes, trained more pilots, had more fuel, more steel, more everything. Germany couldn't match that. Neither could he. So he stopped trying. He couldn't bear to watch the Luftwaffe's final agony, couldn't stomach more casualty reports, couldn't face his pilots, knowing he was sending them to die in a lost cause. So he hid. In art, in food, in morphine, in fantasy. And the Luftwaffe, what remained of it, died without him. By April 1945, when Soviet tanks rolled through Berlin, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. A few dozen planes, a handful of pilots, no fuel, no hope. Göring's masterpiece had become a memory, and he'd become a relic of a war Germany had already lost. The collapse of the Luftwaffe wasn't just a military failure. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Without air superiority, everything else fell apart. German factories couldn't operate. American bombers hit them day after day, unopposed. Production of tanks, guns, ammunition, everything plummeted. German troops couldn't move. Allied fighters strafed roads, bridges, railways. Supplies couldn't reach the front. Reinforcements couldn't deploy. German cities couldn't defend themselves. Allied bombers struck at will: Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Infrastructure crumbled. The Eastern Front bled. Without air support, German armies faced Soviet tanks and artillery alone. They fought bravely. They died bravely. But they lost. The Western Front collapsed. When the Allies landed at Normandy in June 1944, The Luftwaffe managed just 300 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew 14,000. 300 versus 14,000. That single statistic tells the story. Germany fought the rest of World War II without an air force, like fighting a modern war with medieval weapons. The outcome was inevitable. Historians argue about what doomed Nazi Germany: the invasion of Russia, Hitler's strategic mistakes, the alliance of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. All true, but the loss of the Luftwaffe sealed it. When the sky belonged to Germany, the Wehrmacht conquered Europe. When Germany lost the sky, everything else followed. Göring understood this. That's why he stopped fighting. Not because he was a coward, because he was a realist. He knew the war was lost the moment American bombers flew unopposed over Berlin. Everything after that was just waiting for the end. The Reich lost the sky, and with it, the war. Göring knew it. Standing on that balcony in February 1944, watching American bombers cross Berlin untouched. His pilots knew it, every time they climbed into a fighter with no fuel and no hope. Hitler knew it too, though he'd never admit it. By then, it was far too late. The Luftwaffe that once terrorized Europe died quietly, not in one great battle, but in 1,000 small defeats. Bled dry over Germany's cities. And Hermann Göring, who built it, commanded it, promised it would never fall, spent the rest of his life knowing he'd failed. The sky was lost, and Germany with it.